What does humiliation look like? For one young woman, it looked like the gleaming, mocking surface of a Fazioli grand piano in the middle of a Michelin star restaurant. For the man who put her there, it was just another Tuesday night sport. Julian Thorne, a billionaire whose ego was bigger than his portfolio, decided it would be hilarious to force a waitress to play. He saw her uniform, her tired eyes, her calloused hands, and assumed she was nothing. He and his sycophantic friends were ready to laugh. The entire room held its breath, expecting a train wreck. He thought he was making a joke. But he was about to awaken a sleeping giant, and the sound she would unleash wouldn't just earn applause, it would deliver a verdict that silenced them all. The air in Æthelgard wasn't just air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere of quiet old money. It smelled of truffle oil, vintage Bordeaux, and the faint, crisp scent of freshly printed $100 bills being used to settle the check. Chandeliers dripping with baccarat crystals cast a warm, golden glow on the room, making the diamonds on the patrons' wrists and necks glitter like captive stars. In the center of this opulent universe, a place of honor was given not to a sculpture or a fountain, but to a magnificent Fazioli F278 concert grand piano. Its polished ebony surface was a black mirror, reflecting the silent drama of the diners. It was an art piece, a statement mostly untouched, a silent testament to the restaurant's class. To Elara Vance, the piano was both a sanctuary and a torment. Every night, as she glided between tables, balancing trays laden with seared scallops and Wagyu beef, her eyes would steal glances at it. Her hands, wrapped in pristine white server's gloves, ached with a memory they were forced to suppress. Beneath the thin cotton, her fingertips were still hard, calloused, not from carrying hot plates, but from a lifetime spent dancing across 88 keys. They were the hands of a musician, trapped in the life of a waitress. Elara's life hadn't always been this way. She was the girl who had breathed music, the girl who won state competitions by the age of 12 and had a full-ride scholarship to Juilliard waiting for her at 18. Her future was supposed to be concert halls, not dining rooms. It was supposed to be Chopin and Liszt, not still or sparkling. Then her father's business had collapsed, a spectacular implosion that took their savings, their home, and his health with it. He passed away within a year, leaving Elara and her mother with a mountain of debt, and a diagnosis her mother's multiple sclerosis was aggressive, and required treatments that insurance barely touched. The Juilliard dream dissolved like a phantom. Elara traded her music sheets for a server's notepad, and her grand piano for the unforgiving floors of New York's most exclusive restaurants. Æthelgard was the top of the pyramid, paying just enough to keep the bill collectors at bay and her mother's medication supplied. Tonight, the gilded cage felt particularly suffocating. Table 7 was occupied by Julian Thorne and his court. Thorne was a new money titan, a tech billionaire who had clawed his way to the top with a combination of genius and utter ruthlessness. He wore his success like a weapon, a custom Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than Elara's entire lifetime of debt, and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He wasn't dining. He was holding court, his voice, a confident baritone that sliced through the polite hum of the restaurant. His companions were a collection of yes-men. There was Marcus, a venture capitalist with weak eyes, and a hyena's laugh, and two women who looked like they were sculpted from Instagram filters, their laughter tinkling in perfect practiced harmony with Thorne's pronouncements. Elara had served them before. She knew the drill. Mr. Thorne didn't look at you. He looked through you. He didn't ask. He commanded. He treated the staff like animatronics there to fulfill a function and then disappear. Another bottle of the Petrus, and be quick about it. He'd snapped earlier, not even bothering to look up from his phone. Ilara had simply nodded her face, a mask of professional neutrality. Of course, Mr. Thorne. Inside a familiar, weary anger simmered. She could feel the judgment from his table every time she approached. They saw her black uniform, her tightly pinned hair, and the faint sheen of exhaustion on her brow, and they saw a nobody. They saw a component of the service they were paying for nothing more. They had no idea she could probably dissect the complex chord progressions of a Rachmaninoff concerto better than they could read their own stock portfolios. As she cleared their appetizer plates, her gaze lingered on the fazioli for a second too long. The light caught the golden maker's mark, and a pang of longing so sharp it almost made her gasp shot through her chest. She remembered the weight of the keys under her fingers, the sublime feeling of pouring all her grief, her anger, her joy into the music, until the instrument became an extension of her soul. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. Her momentary distraction was a mistake. "Something catch your eye, sweetheart." Julian Thorne's voice was slick with amusement. He had finally looked at her, but his gaze was dismissive, like a king observing a stable hand. Ilara's cheeks flushed. "No, sir." "My apologies." She gathered the plates, keeping her eyes down. But Thorne wasn't finished. A cruel, playful spark lit his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, a predator who had just spotted a new toy. He gestured with his wine glass towards the piano. "That magnificent beast over there," he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "A fazioli. The best money can buy. Costs a fortune, just to keep it tuned for the occasional lounge lizard they hire on weekends." He then turned his gaze back to Ilara, his smirk widening. "You look like you appreciate it. Do you play?" The question hung in the air thick with condescension. It wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a setup for a punchline. Ilara was the punchline. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to shut it down, to give a simple self-deprecating "no, sir," and vanish back into the shadows of the service corridors. But the way he looked at her, the sheer, unadulterated mockery in his eyes, made the lie stick in her throat. I used to a long time ago," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. It was the most she could offer of her past, a ghost of a truth. Thorne's eyes lit up. This was even better than he'd hoped. He chuckled and turned to his friends. "Did you hear that she used to?" How quaint. Marcus the sycophant leaned forward eagerly. "What, like hot cross buns?" "Julian, I bet she can nail hot cross buns." The two women giggled, covering their mouths with perfectly manicured hands. The humiliation was a physical thing, a wave of heat that washed over Ilara from head to toe. The nearby tables were beginning to quiet down their conversations, faltering as they tuned into the unfolding drama. This was better entertainment than their crème brûlée. Thorne raised a hand as if to silence a cheering crowd. "No, Marcus. Let's not be cynical. I'm sure our waitress here is a virtuoso in disguise, a regular prodigy." He swirled the deep red liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on Ilara, pinning her in place. "I have a proposition for you." Her stomach twisted into a knot. "Sir, I'll make you a deal," he said, his voice booming with theatrical generosity. "You go over there to that $500,000 piano and you play something for us. Something impressive." He paused for effect, letting the absurdity of his demand settle over the room. Ilara stood frozen, the weight of the empty plates in her hand, the only thing grounding her to reality. "What's in it for me?" She heard herself ask the words, small but defiant. A flicker of her old self, the girl who wasn't afraid to challenge a difficult professor, had broken through the surface. Thorne looked genuinely surprised, then delighted. The mouse was showing a bit of spine. "Oh, I like her," he exclaimed to his table. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, the picture of a benevolent dictator. "All right, you play something that actually impresses me, and I'm a tough critic, and I'll give you a tip that will cover your rent for the next year. Let's say $5,000. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. $5,000. It was a life-changing amount of money for Ilara. It was her mother's next 3 months of medication. It was a brief respite from the crushing weight that sat on her chest every single day. But Thorn continued, and his voice dropped the pretense of generosity, replaced by cold steel if you go over there and plink out a nursery rhyme, or if you embarrass yourself. You do it for free. For our entertainment. A little floor show. He gestured around the room. And I'll have a word with your manager about the quality of his staff. The threat was clear. Fail and you're fired. Humiliate yourself for my amusement. Ilara's mind raced. It was a trap, a cruel, public game designed to put her in her place. He didn't believe for a second she could play. He wanted to see her sit at that glorious instrument and make a fool of herself. He wanted a story to tell his friends about the time he made a waitress cry. The $5,000 was a lie, a poisoned carrot dangled just to make the game more interesting for him. "Sir, I couldn't possibly," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm on duty." "Oh, don't worry about that." Thorn waved a dismissive hand. "I own half the hedge fund that backs this restaurant group. Consider your duty paused." He raised his voice. "Dubois, get over here." Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's manager, scurried over his face, a mask of anxious diplomacy. He was a good man, but a man terrified of his wealthiest clients. "Mr. Thorn, is everything to your satisfaction?" "Not yet, but it's about to be," Thorn said with a grin. "I've just commissioned a private concert. Your waitress here, Ilara, is going to play the piano for us. You have no objections, do you?" Mr. Dubois looked from Thorn's smug face to Ilara's pale, stricken one. He understood the power dynamics perfectly. "Sir, our staff are here to provide dining service, and she will be providing a service," Thorn cut in smoothly, "an entertainment service. At my request. Are we going to have a problem?" Mr. Dubois' shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned to Ilara, his eyes filled with apology and a silent plea. Ilara. She was cornered. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. Whispers rustled through the room like dry leaves. She saw pity in some faces, morbid curiosity in most, and open mockery on the faces at table 7. To refuse now would mean losing her job, a job she desperately needed. To accept meant walking into a bear trap. She looked at Julian Thorn, at his smug, punchable face. He thought he had already won. He thought he knew exactly who she was, a poor girl in a cheap uniform, a nobody to be played with and discarded. He had no idea what he was asking for. He had no idea what kind of storm he was about to unleash. A strange calm settled over her. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. An anger she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Fine. He wanted a show. She would give him a show. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the tray of dirty plates on a nearby service stand. She straightened her back, lifting her chin. She met Julian Thorn's gaze, and for the first time that night, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It was fire. "Fine," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a finality that startled even herself. "I'll play." The moment the word "fine" left her lips, the restaurant fell into an even deeper, more profound silence. It was no longer just background noise for a bit of sport. It was the hush of an arena before the main event. Ilara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she began the walk from table 7 to the Fazioli grand piano in the center of the room. It was the longest 50 feet of her life. Each step was a battle. Her legs felt like lead, and the pristine white apron tied around her waist suddenly felt like a costume for a fool. She could hear the snickers from Thorne's table, a low, venomous sound. Marcus whispered something to one of the women, who let out a stifled shriek of laughter. They were already savoring her failure. She passed a table of an elderly couple who looked at her with sympathetic eyes. The woman gave her a small, encouraging nod. At another table, a businessman was already discreetly filming with his phone, eager to capture the inevitable car crash. Mr. Dubois stood near the host stand, wringing his hands, his face pale with anxiety. He had failed to protect his employee, and the guilt was written all over him. He had chosen the Billionaire over the Waitress, and the shame of that choice was a bitter pill. Ilara focused on the piano. It loomed larger with every step, a sleek black monolith. It was an instrument of immense quality and power, far superior to the aging Steinway upright she had learned on, or the worn-out practice pianos at the conservatory. This was an instrument for a master. The thought was terrifying. What if her fingers didn't remember? It had been 2 years since she'd last touched a piano of this caliber. 2 years of her muscles atrophying her dexterity, fading her spirit, being ground down by the relentless demands of survival. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her anger. "What are you doing? You can't do this. You're not that person anymore." She reached the piano and stood before it for a moment, her reflection a distorted figure on its polished surface. The woman looking back at her was a stranger hair in a severe bun face, etched with worry, wearing a uniform that screamed servitude. But behind the stranger's eyes, the ghost of the musician still lingered. She untied her apron and folded it carefully, placing it on the corner of the piano bench. It was a small act of defiance. The waitress was stepping aside. She then did something that made Thorne's group lean forward in their seats. She slowly, deliberately pulled off the white service gloves, revealing her hands. They weren't the soft, delicate hands of the women at Thorne's table. They were strong with long, slender fingers, and on the tips clear, even in the dim light, were the pale, hardened ridges of calluses. The telltale sign of a pianist. Julian Thorne noticed. A flicker of something uncertainty perhaps crossed his face for a fraction of a second before his arrogant smirk reasserted itself. So she'd taken lessons as a kid. Big deal. It made the game all the more amusing. Ilara sat on the plush leather bench. It felt alien and yet perfectly familiar. She adjusted the height slightly, a motion so ingrained it was instinctual. She ran her hand lightly over the fallboard, feeling the smooth, cool wood under her palm. Then she lifted it, revealing the pristine, intimidating expanse of black and white keys. They gleamed under the chandelier light, a perfect, silent promise. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes. The sounds of the restaurant faded away, the distant clink of cutlery, the hum of the air conditioning, the expectant whispers. In her mind, she cleared away the noise of the past 2 years. She pushed aside the images of hospital rooms, the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table, the condescending faces of 1,000 wealthy patrons. She let the silence in her head expand, creating a space for the music. And in that space, she thought of her mother, of her quiet strength and unwavering belief in her daughter's talent. She thought of her father, who had worked himself to the bone to pay for her first piano lessons, and who would sit for hours listening to her practice, his face alight with pride. And she thought of Julian Thorne. She thought of his casual cruelty, his assumption that her worth was defined by her job. The cold anger returned, but it was different now. It was focused. It was fuel. She would not play a simple, pretty piece to prove she had some skill. She would not play something to entertain them. She would play her story. She would play her rage, her sorrow, her defiance. She would take all the ugliness of this moment and turn it into something so powerful and so beautiful that it would shatter the smug composure of every single person in that room. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. The entire room held its breath. Julian Thorne leaned back, a king in his throne, ready for the jester's performance to begin. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive wine. Then her fingers descended. The first notes that broke the silence were not gentle. They were not the tentative plinks of an amateur searching for a melody. It was a low, rumbling G minor chord, played with a depth and resonance that seemed to make the very air in the room vibrate. It was a sound full of foreboding and sorrow, a question asked of a dark and empty sky. It was the opening of Frédéric Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor Opus 23. For the musically uninitiated in the room, it was simply a startling, somber opening. But for the few who knew, and in a place like Ethelgard, there were always a few, it was an audacious, almost insane choice. This wasn't a pleasant dinner tune. It was a masterpiece of the Romantic era, a sprawling, technically ferocious epic that demanded not just virtuosity, a term often thrown around lightly, but profound, emotional maturity. It was a musical mountain, and this waitress, this girl in a black and white uniform, had just announced her intention to climb it. Julian Thorne's smirk faltered. The wine-glass paused halfway to his lips. That opening chord had a weight, a professional gravity that he had not expected. Marcus stopped chuckling. He exchanged a confused glance with Thorne. This wasn't hot cross buns. Elara's eyes remained closed. She wasn't in the restaurant anymore. She was alone with the music, the fazioli, an extension of her own body. Her left hand began the slow, melancholic waltz of the introduction, each note placed with heart-breaking precision. Her right hand joined, weaving a simple, mournful theme that spoke of lost dreams and quiet desperation. It was the sound of her life for the past 2 years, the endless, weary rhythm of her shifts, the quiet grief for the future she had lost. Then the mood shifted. The tempo quickened. Her fingers, hesitant at first, found their old fire. They began to fly across the keys, a cascade of notes, a sudden storm of passion. This was the anger, the frustration, the feeling of being trapped. The music swelled a torrent of sound that washed over the diners, leaving them stunned. Forks were lowered to plates. Conversation ceased entirely. The only sound in the entire restaurant was the piano. Mr. Dubois, standing by the entrance, felt tears welling in his eyes. He wasn't just hearing music. He was hearing a confession, a primal scream, wrapped in a velvet glove of classical form. The piece progressed a journey through darkness and light. There was a secondary theme, a moment of exquisite soaring beauty, a brief lyrical passage that was pure hope. Elara poured every memory of her father's smile, her mother's encouragement, the joy she felt when she was accepted to Juilliard into those notes. Her body swayed with the music, her movements fluid and economical, the mark of a truly trained pianist. There was no wasted motion, only pure, unadulterated expression. She was no longer just playing the notes Chopin had written. She was interpreting them, imbuing them with the raw, painful authenticity of her own experience. The ballade became her autobiography. The thunderous, octave-filled passages were her rage at the injustice of her family's ruin. The delicate crystalline runs were the fleeting moments of peace she found in her mother's presence. At one table, in a quiet, secluded corner, sat an elderly man dining alone. He had been a silent observer of the entire drama. Dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored tweed jacket, he had an air of quiet authority. From the moment Elara had sat down, he had put down his fork and given her his complete, undivided attention. His name was Maestro Anton Volkov, the legendary and notoriously reclusive former conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He was a man who had seen and heard it all, a man for whom a performance was either perfection or an insult. As Elara played, Maestro Volkov's stern, weathered face was a mask of intense concentration. His eyes, which had critiqued the world's greatest musicians, were wide with disbelief. He wasn't just listening to a talented amateur. He was hearing a voice, a unique, powerful, and utterly authentic musical voice that he thought no longer existed in this generation of technically perfect but emotionally sterile performers. He heard the phrasing of a poet, the power of a warrior, and the vulnerability of a wounded soul. The ballad approached its climax, the coda. It is one of the most difficult and explosive passages in the entire piano repertoire. A furious, demonic whirlwind of sound. Elara's hands became a blur, her arms and shoulders engaged, channeling all her strength into the keys. The Fazioli, this magnificent instrument, roared under her command. It was no longer a piece of furniture. It was a living, breathing creature, and she was its master. The music was a storm, a primal force of nature, unleashed in the center of the serene restaurant. It was violent, it was tragic, it was breathtakingly beautiful. The final crashing chords, a series of powerful octaves descending into the abyss, shook the room. And then the final note, a thunderous, solitary G. She struck it with all the finality of a judge's gavel. It rang out, hanging in the air, vibrating with all the emotion she had poured into it. And then, silence. A silence so absolute, so profound, it was deafening. No one moved, no one breathed. The entire room was frozen, trapped in the echo of that final, devastating note. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was a heavy, weighted silence, thick with shock and awe. The spell Elara had woven with her music still held every person in the room captive. She remained at the piano, her head bowed her chest, heaving as she caught her breath. The adrenaline of the performance coursed through her, leaving her trembling. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, the polished ivory, now warm from the furious energy she had expended. She slowly lifted her head and opened her eyes, bracing herself for the reaction. She expected awkward, polite applause. She expected the smirks to have returned to Thorne's table. She expected the world to click back into its familiar, cruel alignment. But it didn't. Julian Thorne was staring at her, his face completely drained of color. His jaw was slack, the arrogant smirk erased, as if it had been wiped clean. The wine glass was still in his hand, forgotten. He looked like a man who had just witnessed an act of God, something so far beyond his comprehension that it had short-circuited his entire world-view. He had wanted to humiliate a waitress. Instead, he had been annihilated by an artist. Marcus and the two women were similarly dumbstruck, their faces a comical tableau of disbelief. The man who had been filming on his phone had lowered it, his expression one of pure reverence. Throughout the room, diners simply stared, their expensive meals growing cold on their plates. They had come for a meal, they had received a revelation. Then a single sound cut through the stillness. Clap. It was not loud or boisterous. It was a sharp, deliberate, authoritative sound. Clap. Clap. All eyes turned towards the source. It was the old man in the tweed jacket, Maestro Anton Volkov. He was slowly getting to his feet, his gaze fixed solely on Elara. His applause was not the polite patter of a restaurant patron. It was the measured, respectful tribute of one artist to another. As he stood to his full imposing height, the spell broke. A woman at a nearby table burst into tears. Another man shot to his feet, and then another. A wave of applause erupted, not the polite applause of a dining room, but a thunderous, passionate standing ovation. It was a roar of approval, of gratitude, of shared humanity. People were cheering, whistling their faces alight with an emotion they had not expected to feel that evening. Elara was stunned. The sound washed over her, a wave of validation, so powerful it almost knocked her off the bench. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the strangers who were on their feet, their eyes shining, and for the first time in years, she saw herself not as a servant, but as the person she was always meant to be. Only one table remained seated. Table 7. Julian Thorne and his friends were frozen in their chairs, a small, silent island in a sea of adulation. The ovation wasn't for them. It was at them. It was a collective repudiation of their cruelty. They were no longer the center of attention. They were irrelevant footnotes to Elara's triumph. The applause finally began to subside, and Maestro Volkov took a step forward. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes never leaving Elara. The crowd parted for him instinctively, as if recognizing his authority. He stopped beside the piano, looking down at her. His face was stern, but his eyes, a piercing blue, held a fire she recognized. It was the fire of music. Ballade number 1 in G minor. He said his voice, a low, resonant rumble with a thick Russian accent. Many play the notes. Very few understand the poem. You young lady. You bled the poem. Elara could only stare, speechless. Volkov then turned his head slowly, and his gaze swept over the room, before landing like a physical blow on Julian Thorne. The air grew cold. You, Volkov, said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You with the expensive watch and the cheap soul. You thought this was a joke. Thorne flinched, as if he'd been struck. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time in his adult life, he was utterly powerless. His money meant nothing here. His influence was a puff of smoke in the face of the towering moral authority that was Anton Volkov. You sit in this fine restaurant. Volkov continued, his voice resonating with contempt, and you think you have the right to command a performance for your own amusement. You are blind. You are deaf. You are in the presence of a gift, a true, rare gift, and all you can see is a uniform. You did not ask for a song. You demanded a humiliation. But the only person humiliated here tonight is you. He let the words hang in the air, a final devastating verdict. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every word was a dagger. Julian Thorne shrank in his seat, his face a mask of scarlet shame. He couldn't meet Volkov's gaze. He couldn't meet anyone's. He just stared down at his plate of uneaten steak, a king dethroned in his own court. Volkov turned his back on Thorne, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He looked back at Elara, and a hint of a smile touched his lips. You have calluses on your soul, child, he said softly. It makes the music honest. I have not heard honesty like that in 20 years. My name is Anton Volkov. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock you will be at the stage door of Carnegie Hall. You will ask for me. We have much to discuss. He reached into his jacket, produced a simple business card, and placed it gently on the piano's music stand. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a shattered billionaire, a room full of awestruck patrons, and a young woman whose entire world had just been reborn in the crucible of a single song. In the wake of Maestro Volkov's departure, the atmosphere in Ethelgard was irrevocably changed. The standing ovation had subsided, but a buzz of electric excitement remained. Diners spoke in hushed, excited tones, no longer about business deals or society gossip, but about what they had just witnessed. Elara was no longer a waitress. She was a phenomenon. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. Mr. Dubois, his face streaked with tears, rushed to her side. "Elara, my God, I am so sorry. I never should have." Elara gave him a small, weary smile. The anger she had felt was gone, replaced by a profound, trembling sense of disbelief. "It's all right, Mr. Dubois." She looked over at table 7. The party was over. Marcus and the 2 women were avoiding eye contact with everyone, their faces burning with second-hand shame. They were desperately trying to become invisible. The evening that was meant to cement their status in Thorne's orbit had instead made them pariahs. Julian Thorne himself looked broken. He had built his entire identity on the foundations of power control and the perception of others. He used money to bend the world to his will, but tonight he had encountered 2 forces his wealth could not touch: authentic talent and moral authority. Elara's music had stripped him of his power, and Volkov's words had stripped him of his dignity. He was exposed not as a titan, but as a small, cruel man. He fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking. He threw a black credit card on the table without even looking at the bill. He wanted to flee. But as he stood up, he made the mistake of looking at Elara. She was standing by the piano holding Anton Volkov's business card, as if it were a holy relic. Her face was no longer tired or defeated. It was luminous. She was no longer a victim of his cruel game. She was the victor. And in her eyes, he didn't see hatred or triumph. He saw something far worse: indifference. He no longer mattered. That look was the final, crushing blow. Without a word to his companions, he turned and practically fled the restaurant, a disgraced king abandoning his castle. As the remnants of Thorne's party scattered like cockroaches in the light, a new procession began. Diners, one by one, approached Elara at the piano. The elderly woman who had nodded at her earlier came and took her hand. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, my dear." "Thank you." The businessman who had filmed her approached his phone, now back in his pocket. "I apologize for filming," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I started because I expected a disaster. I kept filming because I was witnessing a miracle. I've deleted it. A moment like that shouldn't be a viral video. It was sacred." Then came the $5,000. A different man, a hedge fund manager, from a table across the room who had seen the whole thing, walked up to her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said quietly, placing a personal check on the piano. It was made out to Elara Vance for the sum of $10,000. The bastard welched on his bet. "I'm doubling it. Consider it an investment in your future." Before Elara could protest, he simply smiled and walked away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mr. Dubois insisted she take the rest of the night off, paying her for the full shift and adding a significant bonus from the restaurant's account. Her fellow servers, who had watched from the wings with a mixture of horror and pride, hugged her, their faces beaming. She was their champion. She had stood up to the kind of customer they all dreaded and had won in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Finally, Elara gathered her things from the staff locker room. She held Volkov's card in one hand and the unexpected check in the other. It was more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. It was a lifeline. It was a beginning. As she stepped out of the restaurant's back entrance into the cool night air of the city, the sounds of New York, the distant sirens, the rumble of the subway, the chatter of people on the street seemed different. The city was no longer a labyrinth of challenges and hardships. It was a city of possibilities. She pulled out her phone and called the one person she needed to speak to. "Mum," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Ilara, honey, is everything okay? You sound funny." Tears began to stream down Ilara's face, but for the first time in years, they were not tears of sorrow or stress. They were tears of overwhelming cathartic joy. "Everything is more than okay, Mum," she whispered into the phone. I think everything is about to change." She had walked into Ethelgard that evening as a waitress, invisible and weary. She was walking out as an artist, rediscovered and armed with a future. The walk to the piano had been one of shame, but the walk away from it was one of liberation. The next morning, the city felt electric. Ilara stood across the street from the hallowed stage door of Carnegie Hall on West 56th Street. The grandeur of the building was intimidating, a temple of music where legends had been made. For years, she had only allowed herself to walk past it, a painful reminder of the life she'd been forced to abandon. Today she was walking through its doors. Clutching the strap of her bag, which contained her old worn-out sheet music, she took a deep breath and crossed the street. At the door, a gruff security guard looked her up and down skeptically. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone implying she was lost. "I'm here to see Maestro Anton Volkov." Ilara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's expecting me." The guard's eyebrows shot up. "The maestro. He doesn't see anyone," but he grudgingly picked up the phone. "I have a Miss Ilara Vance for Maestro Volkov." He listened for a moment, his expression shifting from disbelief to surprise. "Yes, Maestro." "Right away." He hung up and looked at Ilara with newfound respect. "This way, miss." He led her through a maze of corridors, the walls lined with posters of world-famous orchestras and legendary soloists. The air hummed with the faint, distant sounds of a rehearsing orchestra. Finally, they arrived at a large rehearsal studio. Inside, sitting at another magnificent grand piano, this one a Steinway, was Maestro Volkov. He was not in his tweed jacket, but a simple black turtleneck, and he looked even more formidable in the harsh light of the studio. He gestured for her to come in. "You came," he said. "It was not a question." "You told me to," she replied. A rare smile touched his lips. "Good. Punctuality is the start of discipline. Discipline is the foundation of art." He gestured to the piano. "Sit. Play for me again. No audience this time. No billionaire fool. Just you, me, and Brahms. Concerto No. 2. The opening." It was another monumental test, but this time there was no fear. She sat at the piano, her hands finding the keys as if they were coming home. When she played, the music was different. The anger and desperation from the previous night were gone. In their place was a profound sense of hope, of gratitude, of rebirth. Volkov listened, his eyes closed, nodding slowly. When she finished the opening passage, he was silent for a long moment. "The technique is rusty," he said bluntly. 2 years of neglect have made your fingers slow. Your phrasing is raw, unrefined." Ilara's heart sank, but he continued, opening his eyes and fixing her with his intense gaze. "The soul is there. The fire is there. That cannot be taught. The rest, the rust, the mechanics, that is just work. And we will work." And so began her new life. Ilara's days were no longer filled with balancing trays and appeasing rude customers. They were filled with grueling 8-hour practice sessions under the exacting tutelage of Anton Volkov. He was a ruthless teacher, breaking down her technique and rebuilding it from the ground up, stronger than before. He pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed, demanding not just perfection, but truth in every note she played. With the money from the check, she was able to move her mother into a better care facility and hire a nurse, lifting the heaviest burden from her shoulders. Her mother, seeing the light back in her daughter's eyes, began to improve her spirit, buoyed by Elara's newfound happiness. The story of the waitress who silenced Ethelgard became a quiet legend in New York's elite circles. Julian Thorne disappeared from the society pages for months, his public humiliation having sent him into a self-imposed exile. When he did re-emerge, he was a quieter, more subdued man. The encounter had irrevocably cracked his armor of arrogance. 6 months after that fateful night, Elara Vance stood in the wings of the main stage at Carnegie Hall. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform, but a simple, elegant black gown. She was the surprise guest soloist for the New York Philharmonic's Spring Gala, with Maestro Anton Volkov coming out of retirement to conduct for this one night only. As the house lights dimmed and a hush fell over the thousands of people in the audience, Volkov turned to her. "Are you ready, child?" he asked. Elara looked out at the vast, iconic hall, a place she had only ever dreamed of. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the struggle, the soul-crushing shifts, and the single terrifying moment of defiance that had changed everything. She smiled a genuine, radiant smile. "I was born ready," she said. And she walked onto the stage, not to be humiliated, but to be heard. The final chord of the Brahms concerto hung in the cavernous space of Carnegie Hall, a resonant, triumphant sound that seemed to crystallize the very air. For a breathless moment there was silence, the same profound silence that had filled the restaurant 6 months prior. But this was not a silence of shock. It was one of utter enchantment. Then the hall erupted. The sound of 3,000 people rising to their feet was like a tidal wave. It washed over Elara, a physical force of pure adulation. Bouquets of roses and lilies rained down onto the stage, and the applause was a sustained roar, echoing from the gilded balconies to the velvet-draped boxes. Elara stood her hand, clasped in Maestro Volkov's, taking bow after bow. Her face flushed with a joy so intense it felt like a physical ache. She looked out at the blur of faces, a vast ocean of humanity united in this moment, and saw not a single ounce of pity or scorn. They saw her not for the uniform she once wore, but for the music she had given them. Beside her, Volkov, the stern, unyielding maestro, had a look of fierce pride in his eyes, the closest he ever came to an open smile. He squeezed her hand, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. "You have arrived." Backstage was a whirlwind of joyous chaos. Musicians from the orchestra patted her on the back, their faces beaming with respect. Board members and wealthy patrons, the same class of people she once served in nervous silence, now crowded around her, desperate to shake her hand and offer breathless congratulations. Her agent, a shrewd woman Volkov had hand-picked, was already fending off offers for international tours and recording contracts. Yet amidst it all, Elara felt a strange sense of calm. She navigated the praise with a quiet grace, her thoughts drifting to her mother, who had watched the entire performance via a private live stream from her room, a gift from Volkov. They had spoken briefly during the intermission, her mother's voice, weak but filled with more happiness than Elara had heard in years. That was the only applause that truly mattered. An hour later, the crowds had thinned, and Elara finally found refuge in her private dressing room. The small space was overflowing with flowers, their sweet perfume thick in the air. She sank onto a small sofa, the silk of her concert gown cool against her skin, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening. She had done it. She had walked onto the world's most famous stage and claimed it as her own. She closed her eyes, letting the last echoes of the music fade from her mind when a soft, hesitant knock came at the door. "Come in," she called out, expecting it to be Volkov or her agent with final instructions. The door opened slowly. The man who stood in the doorway was the last person she ever expected to see. It was Julian Thorne. He was utterly transformed. The razor-sharp arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary uncertainty. He wore another impeccably tailored suit, but it seemed to hang on him a costume for a role he no longer knew how to play. His face was thinner, and there were shadows under his eyes. He looked hesitant, almost afraid, like a man approaching a judge to hear his sentence. Ilara's body went rigid. A phantom echo of the humiliation, the cold anger she had felt that night, flickered within her. But it was distant, like a memory from someone else's life. She was not that cornered waitress anymore. She was sitting in a star's dressing room at Carnegie Hall. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even and calm. There was no fear in it and no malice. It was simply a statement of fact. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice, raspy, unfamiliar, without its usual coating of smugness. "Ilara, I know I have no right to be here. I asked your agent and she refused, so I spoke to the head of the board, made a donation. It's what I do." He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "Throw money at things until I get my way. It's the only skill I truly have." He took a tentative step into the room. He wasn't looking at her as a conquest or a plaything, but with a kind of desperate awe. "I was in the audience tonight," he said, quietly. "Box seats. I heard everything. What you did up there, it was..." He struggled for the word. "Magnificent. It was a testament." Ilara remained silent, simply watching him, giving him nothing. She would not make this easy for him. He seemed to understand. He took a deep breath. "I didn't come here to offer empty congratulations. I came here to apologize. No, that's not right. An apology is insufficient for what I did. I came here to try and explain and to atone. In my world, we see people as assets, as leverage, as competitors or subordinates. We don't see them as people. You were a waitress. In my mind, that was your entire definition. I treated you like a thing because it was easier, because it made me feel powerful. It was a pathetic, cruel, and unforgivable act of a profoundly insecure man. He looked down at his own expensive shoes as if ashamed of them. When you played that night, you didn't just silence the room. You silenced me. You took my entire worldview, built on money and power and status, and you shattered it into a million pieces with a song. You showed me what real power is. It's not forcing people to do your bidding. It's the ability to create something beautiful out of pain. I've never been able to do that." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a simple, thick envelope, placing it not on her dressing table, but on a small table near the door, as if he knew he had no right to approach her. "This isn't for you," he said quickly, seeing the flash of defiance in her eyes. "My money can't touch you. I know that. I wouldn't insult you that way. This is something else. After that night, I did some research. I learned about your parents, about your father's business, about your mother's illness, about Juilliard." He looked up, and for the first time she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Inside that envelope are the formation documents for a new charitable foundation, the Vance Endowment. It will provide full 4-year scholarships to Juilliard for gifted musicians from low-income families. A full ride covering tuition, housing, and expenses. The first scholarship has already been awarded. The foundation is endowed in perpetuity. It will outlive me. It will be the only decent thing my money has ever built." Ilara stared at him, stunned into silence. This was not what she had expected. It was not a check, not a bribe, not an empty gesture. It was a meaningful, lasting act of penance. Finally she spoke. "Why? Because you made me see," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You made me see the cost of a world where a talent like yours could be silenced by a stack of medical bills. I caused that pain for one night. The system causes it every single day. I can't fix my own soul, Miss Vance, but I can at least try to fix a small broken piece of the world I helped create." He backed towards the door. "That's all I came to say. I will never bother you again. Congratulations on your triumph. You earned it." He turned to leave. "Julian," she said. He stopped his hand on the doorknob and turned back. She stood up and walked over to the table, looking at the envelope but not touching it. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "What you did to me was wrong. But what you have done here, it's a good start." A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost painful to watch, crossed his face. He simply nodded, unable to speak, and then he was gone, slipping out of her life as quietly as he had stormed into it. Elara was left alone in the quiet dressing room, the scent of roses mingling with the faint echo of a billionaire's confession. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw the girl from the restaurant, the daughter, the student, and the artist on the stage of Carnegie Hall. They were all her. The past had not been erased, but it no longer had any power over her. It had been transformed, like the discordant notes of a painful memory, resolving into a beautiful, hopeful chord. Her future was not about revenge or proving people wrong. It was about the music. It always had been. She picked up a single white rose from a vase, its petals perfect and unblemished, and walked out of the dressing room, ready for the overture of the rest of her life. Elara's story is a powerful reminder that a person's circumstances never define their worth. A uniform can hide a virtuoso, and a job title can obscure a powerful soul. Julian Thorne saw a waitress and tried to make her a punchline. Instead, he revealed a queen. That night, the silence in that restaurant wasn't just about a beautiful performance. It was the sound of prejudice being shattered, of cruelty being answered by grace, and of a forgotten dream being roared back to life by the power of a single defiant act. It proves that true wealth is not what you have in your bank account, but the passion you carry in your heart. If Elara's story of resilience and triumph inspired you, and you believe in the power of hidden talent, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that prove a person's value is never ever up for debate. Thank you for listening.